So the answer basically is the combination of Congress and the president. They're the ones that authorize spending that happens, including tax changes or spending changes. But probably the scary answer there is kind of no one is driving the train because if you have a highly politicized, a polarized environment, right? So Congress is gridlocked. One side doesn't want to raise taxes, one side doesn't want to cut spending, or even in many cases, both sides don't want to cut spending, or at least certain types of spending, right? So right now in the U.S., for example, neither side particularly wants to cut Social Security, neither side particularly wants to cut Medicare. Especially those are the recipients of those are the demographics that vote. And so basically a lot of that spending is locked in. So a lot of times when people hear deficits, they think, is it Trump's fault? Is it Biden's fault? Whose fault is it? But it's actually accumulated decisions. Some of that is a lot of it was during COVID and after COVID and all these kind of current things that are happening that is a factor. But even things, for example, part of why we have so much debt is the Iraq War, right? But people forgot about that. That's 2 decades ago since it started. And then even before then, it's kind of the construction of these entitlement systems. The fact that, as kind of more and more of that now the baby generation, as they enter their retirement years, they're on the receiving side of more of these things. The U.S. also has the highest healthcare spending per capita in the world for multiple reasons, and that feeds into it. So all these things are kind of to varying degrees locked in and developed over the course of decades. And so the process of trying to rein that in is kind of outside of any one person's control. It would take massive reforms, whereas monetary policy tends to be more centralized. There's only a handful of people that are involved in those key decisions. And so that's kind of why I use the meme, nothing stops this train, because it's not like a handful of people can get in the room and be like, okay, we're going to fix these things now. There's so many moving parts, so many people that disagree, so much stuff that's legacy built up, accumulated problems that fixing it is nearly impossible in any sort of investable time horizon, which is kind of a challenge. And so it's like they sped up the train and then they kind of broke the lever,
Hmm.
so there's no one that can really stop it.
In this insightful analysis from Lynn Alden, she delves into the intricate web of fiscal policy and its profound impact on the US economy, with data revealing that the US has the highest healthcare spending per capita globally and an accumulated deficit exacerbated by historical decisions like the Iraq War. Lynn paints a stark picture of fiscal dominance. Congress and the president hold the reins, yet gridlock and polarization stall meaningful action. As fiscal deficits swell, commercial real estate struggles, while certain sectors thrive.
Partly what's stronger is that the overall deficit as a percentage of GDP is just structurally bigger. So even putting aside monetary policy, just there's a larger deficits flowing into the economy, which are a type of stimulus, at least nominally.
Mm.
They might not boost the real economy, depends on what they're spending on, but they do tend to boost the nominal economy, which is, for example, if you boost Social Security, the money that they receive, they can go out and buy more things, or at least
Mm.
there's more dollars chasing things, which can drive the prices of those things up, right? So that's why it's complicated between nominal and real, but basically it's a type of nominal stimulus. And so the main levers that fiscal can pull is they could choose to raise or lower taxes. That would have
Mm.
probably a bigger impact on inflation than monetary policy decisions. They could choose or not choose to do certain spending actions, right? So things like the Inflation Reduction Act, are kind of ironically named. It's a form of deficit spending. Decisions whether or not to alleviate student loans, decisions
Mm.
on military financing support abroad, right? Which a lot of that actually gets spent domestically. It goes into the military industrial complex, kind of circulates that way, right? So all these different levers of either spending or taxing, um, those are things that can be impactful. And one thing when you have fiscal dominance, you have a bigger than normal dislocation between different sectors. And so, for example, commercial real estate right now is in a world of hurt because not much of the fiscal deficits are flowing to commercial
Mm.
real estate. But they are impacted by the fact that the Fed is pretty tight right now, right? So they have over 5% interest rates. It's a very leveraged industry. They were impacted by work from home and just kind of shifting needs of office space. So it's kind of a perfect storm of things that is putting downward pressure on commercial real estate and not really assisting them in any way. So they're still under as an industry, they're still under monetary dominance. Whereas, for example, if you're doing restaurant or travel type of things, you're less interest rate sensitive, and people that are on the receiving side of Social Security and upper middle class and, hold a lot of money markets, they're the ones traveling and eating out and doing all these kind of things. So that's good for the American Expresses of the world. That's good for the, booking.coms of the world. Anything travel related that's kind of, pretty strong in its niche is generally more on the receiving side of the fiscal deficits, or at least their customers are. And they're not really on the harmful side of the monetary policies. That's kind of what you get. And then it becomes in fiscal's control, like basically Congress and the president, where they can direct that fire hose of money to whatever they want. They, in the 1940s, they directed it at kind of the younger side of the population, the GIs fighting the war, manufacturing capacity, energy capacity, the highway system. That's kind of where they directed that money. At the current time, a lot of that's directed toward Social Security, Medicare, military stuff. That's where a lot of that's flowing. A few years ago, it was flowing more broadly. It was flowing to, almost everybody. And one of the challenges is how opaque it is. So, for example, people, when they think of stimulus, their first thought is stimulus checks. Whereas I keep pointing out how powerful the PPP loans were and how kind of corrupt a lot of those were. Because, for example, when they look at the numbers, something like 2/3 of it, the vast majority of it went to the top 20% of the population. So it's like, person down the street got a handful of, 4-figure stimulus checks. They got, like 600 here and then like, 1,200 here. And then they got child care tax credits. It added up to, several thousand, 4 figures. Whereas, there were like law firms or investment firms or technology firms that were never really planning on laying anyone off. And they would just get like $1 million and that would just go to the bottom line of the owners.
Right.
And and they would just buy a house or buy whatever the case is. And of course, some of them were so outrageous they got prosecuted for fraud, but a lot of them they followed the letter of the law, but it went to the bottom line of the business, and that's kind of there was upper middle class or kind of wealthy class spending, that was stimulatory for things like upper class homes or other luxury items, right? So across the spectrum, wherever the fire hose goes tends to be the recipients that are doing pretty well.
Continuing her analysis, Lyn Alden highlights the compounding effect of accumulated debt on the public ledger, tracing back over 40 years of declining interest rates and increasing debts. She emphasizes that the shift from private to public debt isn't orchestrated by a single decision, but rather by a series of accumulated choices. As fiscal deficits rise, the Federal Reserve's monetary policy becomes more constrained, compelled to keep the sovereign bond market liquid even when it may prefer otherwise. Lyn warns of potential complications if inflation persists above target levels.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. And rather than kind of giving them the power, it's more like over time the fiscal side kind of elbowed its way through until it took the power. And it was, it's not even necessarily intentional. It's more just like accumulated debt level is what eventually causes it. So when you have that 40 years of declining interest rates and higher debts, every time there's a recession, you get a little bit of a transfer of private debt onto the public ledger. And after 4 or 5 of those recessions or more, you get interest rates all the way to zero. At that point, you've transferred a lot to the public ledger, right. And that's where it starts to snowball. So it's not like one Machiavellian decision to kind of do that. It's like a bunch of accumulated decisions led to that point. And then the monetary policy gets more restricted because it's like, well, we have to, there's times where they have to increase their balance sheet, even though they prefer not to, because they have to kind of keep the sovereign bond market liquid. So they kind of, maybe they prefer, like during the early 2023, when banks were kind of choking on treasuries and running into some issues, they wanted to help fight inflation, but they went back to multiple months of providing liquidity. Because banks were dealing with an overflow of treasuries and falling treasury prices. And so the Fed kind of had to accommodate what's happening on the fiscal side. And now at this point, for example, the New York Fed is already forecasting that probably by 2025, they're going to go back to gradual balance sheet increases. And the narrative could get pretty awkward if inflation is still above their target and they're going back to no longer shrinking their balance sheet and increasing their balance sheet. And that's what you see, if you look at most emerging markets today, let's say Egypt, for example, they currently have an inflation problem, and they're also increasing their monetary base. Their central bank is doing what is a kind of a form of QE, despite the fact that they have above target inflation. You see that regularly. And the U.S. can enter that type of environment where the Fed is providing liquidity kind of because they have to facilitate these large deficits, even though they prefer not to. And most of their tools are geared toward accelerating or decelerating bank lending, but that's now a much smaller force than the size of the fiscal deficits.
As we wrap up, let's remember the key insights Lyn Alden shared today. She illuminated the intricate relationship between fiscal and monetary policies, underscoring how decades of accumulated decisions have shaped today's economic challenges. Staying informed is vital as we navigate these complexities. If you found this discussion valuable, subscribe for more insights. Don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.